I must admit that approaching this 2012 Left Forum conference, I was a little concerned that with probably 4,000 people and more than 400 panels, this would be a chaotic disaster at some level, and I've been pleasantly surprised that it is an outstanding success. Every panel, or almost every panel, had a very good audience. Many of the panels, according to the people I spoke with, were interesting. Some of them were very controversial. I talked to somebody about Iran. There were 2 Iranian panels that she attended. She was outraged by both of them, but they actually stimulated her thought, which is the most you can expect. I participated in 3 panels, one on the future of the labor movement, which was very, very well attended, and the problem of jobs, a jobless future, which was also very well attended. But this afternoon, we had a panel which was really about the limits of protest and resistance with 4 panelists, Michael Pelias, John Clark of New Orleans, Peter Bratzis, who teaches at Salford, England, near Manchester, and myself. It was a panel which had a very lively discussion and a very active audience. The audience was practically all involved in talking, in disputing, in arguing. And what we really were talking about is not that we were at all opposed to protest and resistance, but that we argued, all of us, that protest and resistance was a necessary and a dramatic and a very inspiring development over the last 6 months, especially with the emergence of the Occupy movement. But it was not sufficient to sustain itself over a long period of time. And so what we had is a 2-hour discussion, more or less a 2-hour discussion, as to what was possible in terms of creating alternatives to the corporate state, alternatives to the increasing repressive state under which we all live in the United States, where the Army, as well as the police, have become militarized. The Army is always militarized, but the police have become militarized in clearing out protesters, where there really is a great rise of conversation on the right, and the left is still not having a serious conversation. John Clark actually presented a view that where we are now is the need to create communities which would have workplaces, which would have consumer societies, which would have neighborhood governance of one kind or another, that would to a large extent be an alternative to the centralized government, either of the city of New Orleans or the state of Louisiana. And he says some of that is going on. And he says that there were 25,000 people who responded to the Katrina catastrophe by volunteering, and some of them have stayed in New Orleans, and they're trying to rebuild some communities. Peter Bratzis made an argument which I thought was incontrovertible. That is to say, it was hard to refute that the nature of the state, the nature of government has changed, so it is no longer really responsive to the people. No matter how much activity you have, no matter how much protests you have, no matter how much anger you have at what is going on, both in terms of the war in Afghanistan right now, and the militarization of American society, and the refusal of both the national government, the executive branch, which includes the president, and the Congress, to actually enact serious reforms in health care and other areas like education. No matter how much protest we've had in the last 6 months, and before that, the state is not going to be responsive. And he gave the example of Greece and Italy, especially Greece, where you have massive protests, where you have general strikes, which are unimaginable in the United States, and still they have not been able to make any change. And one of the reasons for that is they don't have a program of what they mean by the good life. That is to say, they're not oriented to changing life. They're oriented to improving the lives that they have within the framework of the existing state. I actually said that one of the things about the old left, which John had opened up, one of the things about the old left was that the old left created institutions which took care of people's needs. And I cited health care, and I cited dental care, I cited cultural activity, recreation activity, summer camps, a whole variety of activities that the communists in the 30s, 40s, and even through the 50s offered to their members and to their families, the families even on their periphery who were not members, that really met their needs in ways that the government did not, and in ways in which private organizations like corporations did not. We had a brief period where there was pensions and health care offered by government, especially by private corporations that were organized. And now with the decline of union organization, if we're going to rebuild the left, I argue, we need to recreate those institutions that take care of people's needs, not simply do protest and resistance. We used to call it in the 1960s in the New Left, we called it prefigurative activity. That is something that prefigures what we want as life. And so the point of the left should be that we want to change life, not simply that we want to protest what already exists.
Let's follow a specific story that is undoubtedly one of the most important stories of the week from September 30th to October the 12th today. On September the 30th, like many other newspapers around the country, the New York Times reported an impending pilots' strike against Continental Airlines, which had demanded of the unions that represented the workers for the airlines a wage cut. The Continental Airlines workers rejected the wage cut and went out on strike. That was on Friday, September the 30th. It was on the front page of the New York Times, and by Saturday, although there was a pilot's story, and you can see there's a pilot story, you would think it was the same pilots that went on strike against Continental Airlines. By Saturday, October 1st, those pilots disappeared and new pilots appeared, pilots that were asking for the end of the boycott against the Russians for their caper of the Korean Airlines 007. This is the last time that the Continental strike is featured in the New York Times news section, October 1st, 1983. On Saturday, October 8th, we get a news story about the Continental Airlines strike, but it is in the business day of Saturday, October 8th, and it is a kind of a roundup story of how the Continental Airlines strike is doing. A wrenching day, a wrenching week at airline. This story has not been preceded by a systematic coverage by the New York Times staff of what has now become one of the major issues, not only in labor relations, but also the major issue for the airlines. Can collective bargaining survive the deregulation of airlines, which means that there will be no regulation of rates and wages have to be negotiated across the table at a condition of recession in the airlines. On Sunday, October the 9th, in the business section again, we get a story about how the corporate assault on wages is going on, and the corporate assault on wages mentions the Continental Airlines strike. In the corporate assault on wages story, there's a quite accurate story by Stephen Greenhouse, a reporter for the New York Times, about how now the the corporations have decided that in the light of deregulation and of recession, the way they're going to deal with their loss of profits and the threats that they have to their industrial position is to make the workers pay. It's a decent story, and so is the one on the 8th, but the story is from the point of view of business. The question for the New York Times is not whether workers' wages and working conditions will be maintained in the light of the corporate assault on wages, but whether corporate profits will be maintained, which I suppose is really an appropriate discussion for a business page of a daily newspaper. The fact of the matter is that in the 10 or 11 days that the New York Times has had the opportunity to cover the Continental Airlines strike, we cannot find in the news section any serious systematic coverage of the strike. Now, this, of course, compares very unfavorably to their meticulous, many-faceted coverage of the Soviet downing of the Korean airline 007 over the Sakhalin Islands several months earlier. The Times was full of front page and middle page coverage of that event. But the Continental Airlines strike, which is being covered, by the way, meticulously by the Wall Street Journal as a business story, is only covered by the New York Times as a business story. It is not covered by the Times as a serious national event. This is an indication of the fact that the New York Times, as a magazine, is capable of giving adequate, although superficial, coverage of sports, of the living, of furniture, of science, often of entertainment, but is not really capable any longer of giving systematic coverage of significant news stories unless they are international news stories and unless they are significantly fed to them by government agencies. It is clear that the continental struggle is a very, very controversial struggle, and so controversial that the New York Times can barely, in its main body of news coverage, define it as a serious and a worthy news story. Had I the time, I could show that there are many other news stories. Of course, New York, forget it. New York doesn't count for the New York Times. But even national news stories about real social movements, real struggles of people, real activity. This continental strike is duplicated potentially in many other instances. The New York Times simply doesn't care. What it really does care about is international news on the one hand, White House handouts, the occasional investigative reporting by very good reporters of the New York Times, and a whole significant magazine format which renders the New York Times as a newspaper of record basically defunct. I think the New York Times is essentially entertainment. And I think we ought to be treating the New York Times as nothing more than whiling away our times when we have nothing better to do.
Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vredos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Yeshiva University here in New York City. This show, from its very beginning, was intended to be a forum for debate and discussion on the possible transformation of America and the world, politically, economically, intellectually, and spiritually. We had clear objectives. It was always about how to build a socially and economically just world rooted in multiracial, multinational, multigender, multisexual orientations, relationships forged in radical love and freedom, focusing on empowering the least of us. Long before the public lynching, death of George Floyd, the pandemic, and the neo-fascist gangster in the White House, the show has tried to explore the truths and lies of who we are and what our system is really about. Too many have lived too many lies for too long. The lies we see and experience today have festered over time and show greater distortion, complexity, and destructiveness than ever. The need for urgency for transformative change is as great as it's ever been. Stanley Aronowitz has powerfully informed every Radical Imagination show we've done since his appearance as co-host on the first one 5 years ago. Pulling the covers off society's charades has been Stanley's life work, and he's done it vigorously with a radical imagination, respect for scholarship and ideas, love of life, art, and music, and with a sense of grace and much fun. Through his many books and articles over 6 decades, from False Promises, Working Class Hero, From the Ashes of the Old, to The Death and Life of American Labor, Stanley has been pulling the cover off the organized labor movement, pointing the way toward a new workers' movement. That movement goes beyond resistance, rebellion, and passivity to the corporate, militaristic America that we all live in. It establishes prefigurative relationships and political activity which can create a true egalitarian and democratic society. As Stanley puts it, we need to change life and not just protest what already exists. We have 2 of Stanley's closest colleagues, friends, and associates on today to discuss his work as one of America's best-known labor public intellectuals and labor activists. Michael Pelias is a philosophy professor at Long Island University in Brooklyn, co-editor with Stanley of Situations Magazine, a project of the radical imagination, and Stanley's longtime friend, colleague, collaborator, and confidant. Emmanuel Ness is a longtime labor activist and scholar of workers' social organizations, comparative labor movements, global South relations, migration and protest movements. He's editor of the Journal of Labor and Society, is a professor of political science at Brooklyn College, the City University of New York, and also a senior research associate in the Department of Sociology at the University of Johannesburg. And he too is a close collaborator, friend, and confidant, correct, of Stanley Aronowitz. And I want to wish both of you the best, and I'm so grateful for you to be on this show here, talking and honoring Stanley's work. So welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jim. Yeah, it's a
Wonderful.
pleasure to be here.
It really is. It's really great to have you two again. So maybe we can get started on how you both started your relationship and collaboration with Stanley in those early days, and what were some of the foundations and roots of those conversations you were having with Stanley and his work, particularly as it relates to the labor movement. Why don't we start with Manny?
Thanks. I've known Stanley for quite some time. Actually, it goes back, my recognition of Stanley's important work goes back actually to the early 1980s when I read his book, False Promises. And then subsequently, another 10 years later, 10 to 15 years later, when I was a student of his. Mm-hmm. And as a student of Stanley, I recognized that he was putting forward an argument that was very different than the conventional labor and employment relations academic who is crunching numbers and looking at ways in which organized labor, in the truest of the sense, unions themselves can build their power or build their numbers. Mm-hmm. And Stanley, unlike many others, was not interested in looking at the union density necessarily. He was interested in looking at the democracy that existed within the unions and amongst workers in various workplaces. So we also had very long discussions, I recall, in the 2000s, early 2000s, about late 90s and early 2000s, about the significance of the new working force that was emerging in New York City. I think we all remember it. It was a New York City that we suddenly found ourselves surrounded by foreign workers, many of them from Mexico and so forth, who were employed in the restaurant industry, in the grocery industry, and so forth and so on, delivery, etc. And we were trying to assess the significance of that on the broader working class of New York. And that relationship has continued through the years in terms of my knowledge and our discussions about the questions of the capacity of workers and working class solidarity over the years. One point that you made at the very beginning, Jim, is that he was incredibly interested, not just in protests, because he and I had a similar view that protest does happen everywhere, every single day. Of course, there are fits and starts, but we will find protests in many parts of the world. I do much of my work in the global South. However, the big issue, and we might have some areas of difference on this question, is whether working class power can be gained as a consequence, working class self-activity and so forth, and expression through agency. So agency becomes a very important issue in all of my work, but his work especially. What is the American union movement all about, and what are other unions around the world trying to do to advance the interests of the vast majority of the population of the world who are actually workers today. You know, he
Sure.
did write the book, The Jobless Future, as you pointed out earlier, and that is true. But, you know, we do have a jobless present now, yet amongst the jobless are workers who are working part-time, who are working informally and in contingent types of jobs. So anyway, I really look forward to this discussion, and thanks, Jim, for having me on.
Sure. I'm so glad you are here. And I'm so glad, Michael, you've joined us as well, because you have so much to say and you've been working with Stanley also for so many years. So comment on what
I
Manny
think we're
just said.
really
Yeah.
honored to have Jim, to have you, Jim, of course, hosting this program and continuing this homage to Stanley's work. And we've been
Absolutely.
through his contributions to education and culture and to basically even Black freedom and civil rights movements earlier on the show, The Radical Imagination. But we're particularly privileged to have Manny here today, who is one of the leading people in the labor movement, both as a theorist and someone who is on the ground. In terms of my own relationship to Stanley, I had known of Stanley's work, since the middle 70s when I was a student in Baltimore. I was very interested in, Marxist approaches to literature and to philosophy, and I was an active reader of Georgy Lukács' History and Class Consciousness, which had just come out, so I had a very long struggle and road forward through philosophy and literature through Marxist studies. And Stanley was the first person that I actually could read in terms of labor studies, and a very accessible book, False Promises, that sort of, transformed me in one way, very much in one way, where I began to see the culture of labor struggle rather than just, as Manny pointed out, labor density or statistical approaches or collective bargaining struggles, much more of the culture of the working class, which was very, very real to me. So the book False Promises had a profound effect on me, even though I didn't know him. I also knew of Stanley before meeting him personally through social text because of a friend of mine in Madison, Wisconsin, where the first issue of Social Text came out. And this was Stanley's foray into, if you will, post-structuralist thinking, a kind of a moment that hit the United States through a kind of French and German invasion in the early 70s all the way through the postmodern moment into the 80s. And so through social text, I also learned of his work, and I learned the scope of his intellect. He wrote a seminal piece on film, the high art form of late capitalism, as a first piece about that. Also looking at the Kuleshov effect and also labor involved in the cinema industry, etc., and the cultural apparatus. So I then had the pleasure, once I moved to New York, to meet Stanley. I was invited to attend his class on the Grundrisse at the Graduate Center, and I was at the New School then. And we hit it off immediately. We riffed on film, we riffed on labor studies, philosophy, etc. And since then have been very, very, very good friends. In 2005, we started Situations, Project of the Radical Imagination together. We've been teaching alternative classes through the Institute of Radical Imagination for the last 10 years, first at the Brecht Forum, the Commons, and now kind of virtually we're doing it, but for many years, alternative classes. And in that class, I still have notebooks filled like this, even, after many years of study, the history of the left, according to Stanley. And I know, Jim, you've attended some of those very good classes.
Yeah.
So my relationship is very deep. We're also, as you said, confidants and very close as friends for those years. And I think I know the work fairly well. I read a lot of the unpolished manuscripts. So I've had that long conversation with him as things shape up. after false promises. Yeah.
Yeah, help us,
Yeah.
help our audience in particular here get grounded in terms of our discussion here, um, in their understanding of what organized labor, the organized labor movement was, the history of it, which of course you both have studied and Stanley has, and what went wrong. What are the critiques that you have and that Stanley had? So for our audience benefit now, give us some structure as to what the false promises were, what went wrong in that organized labor movement, and what needs to happen now at this point. So
Sure. I'm going to defer to Manny on this.
yeah, get us
Let him
started.
started, and I'll maybe piggyback. Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you. False Promises was written in the early 1970s.
Right.
You know, without question, the apogee of the power of the U.S. labor movement, but concomitantly was also the period where capital went on attack against organized labor. You know, we'll have to remember that the post-war accords conferred labor a modicum of power within the workplace, and you know, workers at General Motors and which is the largest company, Ford, et cetera, the largest auto company, were making very high wages relative to the professional classes even of workers. And
Right.
they became, in some respects, if I may, a form of labor aristocracy, you know, where they would have second homes, a mobile home, et cetera, and so forth and so on. But this began to change. And I think probably the most important example, which is found in False Promises, is the Lordstown strike, which represents chapter 1 of his work, or very beginning of the work, which was Lordstown, Ohio, was a new plant that was built by GM to produce Chevy, I believe, Vegas. I don't think anybody remembers the car anymore. But not a very good car, to tell you the truth.
Right.
It was put together.
Little small guy, I think. Remember?
Yeah. And it was they hired a workforce, and this workforce was very militant. Not only were they militant, and this is really very important with respect to understanding the decline of labor, they were more militant than their leaders. They were more militant than the folks that were in Detroit at the UAW headquarters. And so they went on a wildcat strike. They went on an unauthorized strike against a 22-day strike against General Motors. But the strike was not necessarily just against General Motors. It was also against the union. The union leadership was opposed to the strike. And these fairly young, probably mostly men, obviously, young workers were engaged in not just striking, but also vandalizing some of the cars they actually built.
What year was this, Manny, again? What year were we?
It was actually 1972.
Okay.
1972. And this really represents, just right before the major transformation, you know, the move toward the neoliberalism. You find workers saying, you know, we've had it with the kind of industrial speed up that takes place within the workplace, where we have to slap together parts within an automobile or whatever kind of assembly line, and it's monotonous work. And this gets to the question of culture as well. It's meaningless. It's a process that is repetitive. It's a process in which workers,
mind-numbing and heart-wrenching.
It's exploitative even in the context of lower wages. And so, of course, wages declined dramatically subsequently. And I remember meeting with Stanley in Detroit years later. We were talking about Lordstown again. And at that time, General Motors was trying to cut health benefits. In fact, they succeeded in cutting their relationship to providing health benefits to the workers. And the book goes on to discuss other segments, other sectors of the economy and so forth, and how workers are really, and this goes to what Michael is really studies and his analysis, that workers are alienated from the process of work in the United States. they find that there is absolutely no meaning whatsoever in what they're producing. They're producing things, automobiles, or they're producing services, etc., that really do not contribute to the cultural vibrancy of their lives. And so, a strike is something that's highly um, exciting. I've helped organize a number of strikes, and it contribute. It's a phenomenon that is very rare in some respects, although people do go on strikes frequently. Why do I say rare and frequently? But throughout the world, it's frequent. But the decision to go on a strike means that you are not going to get paid for a period of time, and you are asking management for a better contract or so forth and so on. This strike was not so much for a better contract, but for better treatment, because in many ways, the workers were exploited. Their labor was exploited in a Marxian sense. Surplus value was extracted from them in the process of production and so forth. They were forced to work, and they continued to work these monotonous jobs. Michael Burawoy, the sociologist, eminent labor scholar, wrote a book subsequently, and it's very interesting that Stanley wrote the first book on this topic with false promises. But Michael Burawoy, who many people know, who wrote the book that deals with the question of the kind of disdain that workers had within the workplace, that they were in the workplace to just make out, just to finish, they went to work, they engaged in various kinds of production activities, they did their jobs, they didn't necessarily do them in a way that was meaningful to them in any way. The name of the book is Manufacturing Consent. Actually, the Chomsky and Herman work was published much later. But this Manufacturing Consent was truly about manufacturing, and it remains published, I think, in 1979, remains a classic work about how workers really have lost their connection to their unions to a large extent.
And the system was further dividing workers, correct, as well?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I can get into it if you'd like to hear more about it, because and again, Stanley's work is very important because he demonstrates that there's a large degree of differentiation amongst the workforce. They're not only alienated from their, like I said, their job, but they don't have a solidarity that one would have found in the 1930s during the Flint sit-down strike, where workers came together. And this gives you a kind of historical trajectory 30 years earlier to establish the United Auto Workers and to establish a highly militant labor movement and labor union, in this case, and movement that would be based on solidarity. Now, of course, a lot has happened in between the 1930s and the 1970s and the 1970s and the 2020s. So I think that this work is a seminal project, False Promises, and it continues to be compelling today. I believe it was republished by Duke University Press.
Yes.
I have both versions. I have the original version. And it is because work remains an alienating process, that nothing has necessarily changed. And as Stanley would say, trade unions, labor unions that are there to, so to speak, represent them socially, as well as in collective bargaining and so forth, have become nothing more than really insurance companies, managing the kind of collective bargaining agreements they would engage in, managing their pensions and so forth and so on.
Exactly.
And that there is a separated union staff that is highly disconnected to the struggles within the shop floor, and that does not build working class solidarity with.
Absolutely, and that's what Stanley is so much talking about in terms of these political formations, formative movements that are needed, and cooperative commonwealth that he experienced in so many ways as he grew up. with labor-sponsored cooperative housing and healthcare centers. Michael, you want to pick up
Yeah,
on
I was going to just a couple of things about the facts. False Promises, 1973 was the first edition, and represents, as Manny has very eloquently and in detail pointed out, was a paradigm shift in labor studies. It was the first book, at least to my knowledge, that tried to integrate meaningless alienated labor alongside a labor history and multiple struggles. And as Manny pointed out, begins with a strike, a wildcat strike, that not necessarily was only about the bosses, but it was also about the union and the union's inability to represent fairly its workers and take on significant issues other than that of the usual wages and benefits packages. And that the struggle was really for recognition. It was very much, in philosophical terms, a fight to the death for recognition in Hegelian terms in many ways. And Stanley understood this very deeply, unlike I think a lot of the people that wrote very well about labor up until him, but he understood the struggle for recognition, for daily,
respect,
everyday life. Well, for respect, but recognition is the thing that you're actually acknowledged as a human being, and that you are given a place in the society. Your niche, your practice is recognized, right? In a way, yeah. So I think this was really part of the force of the book that opened it up to say, quote, philosophers, I'll put that highly in quotes, such as myself, et cetera, because here is someone dealing with the question of alienation, reification, and the objectification of the labor force in a very original and very, deepened understanding of the culture that produced it and the culture that rose up against only collective bargaining, as Manny pointed out. Another thing that's very radical about Stanley, most people say that NLRB was a great thing, the establishment during the New Deal, going back in history about 40 years earlier in 1935. For Stanley, this was the great labor cop-out. This was the end of labor, really, in a way, as we had known it. And in many senses, going back to this moment of labor peace being established between
giving
the
away
bosses
the right
and
to
the
strike.
labor. Yeah.
Is that part of it too? Giving away the right to strike?
Yes.
How is that?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Which again is the myth of the left. The great working myth is the Sorelian notion of the general strike. As Manny was saying, to strike, you not only are not paid, but you're withholding labor. You're withholding this stupid, meaningless labor as well, which is kind of interesting because it's an act of, why work? This is another, that Stanley's work also. I want to say this about False Promises, how much effect it had. This book was mimeographed, the manuscript was mimeographed and sent around the Italian left to people such as Antonio Negri. Ferruccio Gambino was the one who actually mimeographed it and passed it around, probably one of the most leading vanguard movements in Western Europe of labor activists and, really revolutionaries, right? So this is very interesting how it filtered through. You want to say something to this, Manny? I see. Yeah.
I'd like to say the National Labor Relations Act.
Sure.
One of its provisions, and I think the most damning one, the provision is that during the time of the contract, during the period the contract is signed, if it's a 3-year contract, workers cannot go on strike if the employer violates the agreement, which essentially takes the teeth out of the workers' movement, takes the power out of the workers' movement, and kind of exposes the individual laborer to the high levels of abuse and exploitation of the employer. So this is a really important point. In 1937, we have Flint, as I was saying before, where workers took over the factory, not only in Flint, Michigan, but also in St. Louis at the Emerson plants, where they produced radios and electronics. Take it, 30 years later, you start to see the effect of the NLRA, National Labor Relations Act, on the capacity of workers to engage in self-activity, to express themselves on the job, as workers who are capable of advancing their own interests. And I don't think they liked working on these cars necessarily. These were very flimsily built cars, and General Motors was only interested in producing as many cars as possible, quantity over quality whatsoever, so that the workers would never take pride in the work they're engaged in. But I'd like to say this about Stanley. He is part of a generation of scholars around labor who began to criticize and to investigate, in some ways, the nature of the labor movement itself and organized labor. These include people like Stoughton Lynd, who's written very important works on the alienation of the worker, the fact that workers have lost their control and abilities to engage in collective action on the job and so forth. I think that goes back to what Michael was saying a moment ago. Labor is highly alienated within the workplace. I think we all feel it as workers today. I know Michael and I do, that it's a very stressful process. It's something that is arduous and burdensome. It's something that we have to go back to every single day. And it's also something that, from an economic perspective, does not necessarily advance and allow us to achieve our full abilities within the sphere of life. Our lives are constrained and set back by having to work the 9 to 5, or in our cases today, 9 to 9 job. It's 7 days a week.
24/7 for teachers
24/7,
on the
exactly.
internet.
Right. Isn't one of the things, though, that Stanley is calling for is reaching beyond the labor movement to civil rights, as you pointed out earlier, Michael, to women's movement, feminism, to national liberation struggles. Although, correct me if I'm wrong, he was not that keen on vanguard movements or the governments that some of these liberation struggles created. But he was always about expanding life, in a sense, as you put it, and enriching us through an understanding of music and connection between various people as well. But how does that play in his work, too, the international aspect of this?
If I could just back up for a second. Sure. I mean, Stanley Aronowitz, to me, is representative and is exemplary of the Gramscian notion. Antonio Gramsci had a concept of the organic intellectual. And the organic intellectual is someone who rises of its class upward, right, as part of the emergent class, who is always fighting the traditional dominant intellectuals, right, in many ways. And Stanley was so rooted in this organicity of his own background, his family, his mother especially, who would keep the books on the union, in the garment industry, right, as, going forward, to whom he was very close, all the way through his days as a labor organizer for the atomic workers, right, as well as the oil industry, retail. He had many, many various hats he wore during this period, including, and most people don't know this, he was friendly with Marvin Miller, who ultimately became the commissioner, not the commissioner, the lawyer for Curt Flood, the reserve clause reversal, right, and is now in the Hall of Fame. So I always joke with him, you could have been the commissioner, or you could have been the players union's, chief in a way, because Miller liked Stanley and they had a relationship in the steel workers. So this organicity, I think this is what defined him differently. This is someone who had a background, or is someone who has a background in music, classical music, jazz, popular music, especially rock and roll. As we all know, he was married to Ellen Willis, who was one of the four, quote, horsemen, and I put the men of the rock and roll, group with Grail Marcus, et cetera, back in the day. So he had this popular culture moment as well, and wrote a book, Roll Over Beethoven, on popular culture. So we're not dealing with someone that just was fixed in the labor struggles, collective bargaining struggles, etc. So for me, yes, he always brought so much, and we've talked about this countless times, but he brought so much to the table. You know, when Stanley would enter a room, you knew that there was a wealth, not only of knowledge, but connected knowledge. You know, it's not like it was dispersed, encyclopedic only, or something like that. It was always connected, and connected in a way back to what I think he considers the central problem, and which I see also as something that we really have to think through, is the labor question. What does it mean to work? What does it mean to labor as we go forward in this digital age? What kind of emptiness are we beginning to experience in what I would call the hyper-industrial epoch following Bernard Stiegler instead of just neoliberalism? So,
Manny,
yeah,
you
please, yeah.
and you're have a book that's coming out in March talking about these sorts of issues too, and going beyond protest. So can we try to tie that into what Michael just is saying?
Certainly, and actually, I'm going to try to weave Stanley Aronowitz, who actually cite in the book, is one of the few people in the West that I cite, because I feel that we know that United States is only 4% of the world's population, and that 90% of the world, 94 even, are workers in the global South. They're poor workers who live lives of squalor. Even, you know, I know that we complain a lot in this country, and we should complain even more as conditions erode and we're exploited more, but in the global South, people are surviving every single day. They're having their land taken away from them. They're forced to migrate to urban areas to work in the most destitute conditions, places like Delhi in India, where steel workers work 18-hour days, 7 days a week, and they are people from the ages, young kids from the ages of 12 on up to 40, which is about the time that most people are ready to go there. And if you're working in a job, what I mean by that is to the morgue. There is constant industrial accidents that are taking place every single day. And so, you know, the meaning of work in a place like India, the Philippines, and South Africa is a much more complex set of questions about the very being and the capacity of people to live every day, where the extraction of surplus value is much higher. Stanley Aronowitz was very much attuned to the question of the labor aristocracy. He was a member of my union and Michael's union, the Professional Staff Congress, and he saw the ways in which some academics or some leaders and so forth within the university were treated inequitably and so forth. And he did see a certain kind of privilege that we have or had. I think more would be had would be the better term at the time. And so he also moved into the so my work actually is I'm arguing that there is an absolute necessity to have political organization, a working class organization, which would be a very strong militant revolutionary union, which you were talking about anti-colonial struggles that were taking place. Today we have semi-colonial struggles because countries like the Philippines, like South Africa, Bangladesh, I can go further, are really semi-colonial outposts of the United States and Western Europe to a large extent. So I'm looking at that question. I see Stanley's work is very important because he himself was very disillusioned with, yes, we do hope that certain results take place in the elections on Tuesday. But he was very disillusioned in the Democratic Party and its shift and move, ineluctable move to a more conservative politics. Of course, it originated as a conservative party and stayed that way, in my view, and I think Stanley's view. And so, he ran, I think he ran for, well, I know he ran for governor of the state of New York, in large measure, to advance the labor movement, to advance the conditions of workers, the wages of workers in upstate New York, where people make far lower wages than downstate and so forth. So he recognized the importance of the political party. He did not want to see the linkages that existed within, I would say, our own union and the Democratic Party, which he saw as corrupt and really ineffectual to a large extent. And I actually also see that way. What's the point of having a political party when they're going to do precisely the same thing over and again?
So he was suspicious of the political parties, so-called vanguard parties as well. And he's written so much, as you all know, about prefigurative political activity. Michael, you want to pick up on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, his book Left Turn, I think anticipates some of Manny's work today. Left Turn was an attempt to look at how would we form new political organizations. What does that mean to build a new political formation? And I think Stanley had it with the Democratic Party since '68. We've had long discussions about this, and probably even much earlier. And going back to where we began the show, and Manny was speaking about labor in the '70s, in a very different position than it is now. Well, when C. Wright Mills writes New Men of Power, he's really bemoaning the fact that labor did have real power, but really didn't take it, kind of gave in to the capital order in a way, which is another, moment of time, the 50s, the not so, great 50s of the unspoken majority, et cetera, the silent majority.
Michael, he was certainly for the progressive policies that Bernie Sanders might be expounding.
Well, for revolutionary reforms, Andre Gortz was a very, very important influence on Stanley. The critique of economic reason, farewell to the working class, which was not against the working class or split from the working class. It was an attempt to criticize. Where was that agency? Going back to this question, where's really the agency today? And as Manny speaks, we're in academic unions. I'm in one academic union at LIU, which is, I'm writing a piece. I'm putting the finishing touches on it because there's always something new in terms of its discussed. But, it's a disaster. It's a complete disaster, unionism. And we're feeling this. I'm working from the hyperbolic position. However, on the other hand, it's working in all the unions. None of the unions are really standing up to anything.
They failed.
Look who they, et cetera. So we have very small, hence false promises comes out of the slogan. I can read that. I wanted to do this, kind of the introduction, but I think it's important because he begins the book with a great song, the workers' song on false promises. The clockmakers union is no good union. It's a company union by the bosses. The old clockmakers and the socialist fakers by the workers are making double crosses. The Dubinskys, the Hillquists, the Thomases by the workers are making false promises. They preach socialism, but they practice fascism to serve capitalism by the bosses. This is the song, False Promises, and this is where he gets his title. And, there's a lot to that song. Unfortunately, he's not here with us to sing it because he's good at singing, too. People don't realize it about Stanley. He loves singing labor songs, affectionately speaking. Yeah.
The first show we did, he and Cornell and I, we were singing.
Yes.
We've got only a couple more minutes to go, and we are absolutely going to have to do another show. There's no question about it.
We will. We'll get Stanley singing. Yeah.
We're going to have Stanley on. Stanley is going to be on the next show.
Okay.
We'll all sing whatever we want to sing, whatever he wants to sing.
I'm going to tell him we're going to do a program on Stanley and music. His relationship to music. He'll love it because he was a violinist. I joke with him that Einstein ended up playing violin on Desolation Row, but the Bob Dylan song. But anyway, it would be a lot of fun to do this with him in terms of music. And Manny knows a lot about music too, so maybe he could join us. We'll all go to Stanley's apartment.
We will. And Mike and Manny, let me give you the last minute here.
Yeah.
Of any critique. I know we're going to do this again. That's definite. Finish us off here with any comments, critiques you want to make within that last minute that we have of Stanley and his work or whatever.
I think Stanley is the most important sociologist of his generation who studies labor. I think that his work has seminal influence throughout the United States, and as Michael pointed out, it also had influence in the Italian left and the rise of a new kind of unionism. And the point I wanted to just make is that Stanley was always, and he remains so, an optimist. You know, he might say that the union movement is dead, but he also will say we have to build a better one. And I think that is really kind of, it encapsulizes the way Stanley thought and thinks.
And lived and lives. And we've got to, unfortunately.
And Jim, if I could just add, Manny brought up something very good. To echo Marx, what he just said about the optimism of Stanley, Marx always said the revolution is dead, long live the revolution. That is really the kind of, tension we live. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Long live Stanley, long live us all and the revolution. Thank you so very, very much, Manny and Michael. It's been a privilege and honor. Yeah. We will see you again very, very soon on another show.
Yeah.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Good
to see you.
To the Radical Message. Great seeing you. Take care.